y'all like to hear a story this evening? Papaw was an incredible man. He was born with the 20th century. The cup of life just spilled over in him. He had a way of talking. Behind every word, there was just the edge of a laugh peeking out. And so it was his voice that really struck me one day in 1977. See, I'd been out exploring and getting into mischief, and I was coming in to visit with Papaw. And as I came down the hall, there was a sound. It stopped me cold. It was his voice, but it wasn't his voice. And even at 12 years old, there was something about the sound of that voice that told me, stay out. And so I did what any kid would do. I hid. I tucked myself up against the wall in the hall around the corner, and I listened with my heart pounding in my ears. See, Papaw was talking to Barbara, one of the adult grandchildren. She did ladies' hair over in Florida. And he was telling her about an experience he'd had as a young man half a century before. And hearing that story has now stayed with me for more than 3.5 decades. And if you'll let me, I'd like to share that story with you tonight. See, Papaw was raised and spent his whole life in New Albany, Mississippi. It's the county seat for Union County. It's located about halfway between Oxford and Tupelo in North Mississippi. Union County is a poor farming country. In its 150-year history, prosperity has never touched Union County. This is hills and hollers country, a hilly area cut down by streams. It's a beautiful and lush area. The woods are dense with sweet gum trees, chestnut, live oak, white oak, red oak. And the soil there is a deep red, and it stains. So everything man-made has kind of a rosy hue to it as you go around. Well, it was one Friday morning, September 1925. And Bessie Gaines, she went to pick peas in the field next to her family home. See, the Gaineses, they were sharecroppers. They lived way out in the country, several miles outside of New Albany. Bessie was the daughter of Bob and Amanda Gaines. She was 21 years old. Late that morning, Bessie's mother found her crawling out of the field. She was bloodied and bruised. She said she'd been beaten and ravaged, their word for raped. Well, they found a neighbor who had an automobile. That was still pretty rare in those parts at that time. And they drove Bessie into Dr. May's Hospital in New Albany. And Sheriff Johnny Roberts came in, and he met with Bessie at the hospital. Then he went out, and he gathered a bunch of men together, a posse. And they got together some hounds. Now, these weren't no licking pot hounds. These were professional Mississippi hunting dogs. And they took that pack of men and that pack of dogs, and they went back to that pea patch. And they commenced a tracking. And they picked up a trail right away. And those dogs, they followed that trail. They followed it for 2.5 miles. It led them right to a group of hired men. They were cutting timber on Lawrence Goolsby's place. Suspicion quickly fell on L.Q. Ivy. L.Q. Ivy was 1 month shy of his 18th birthday. He was born and raised not 2 miles from where they stood that day. Now, I need to tell you a couple more facts for some context at this point. Bessie Gaines was Caucasian. L.Q. Ivy was African American. And 1925 was the era of lynching. America had lynchings in nearly every state, including right here in Colorado. But Mississippi led the way. By that fall of 1925, there had been more than 500 lynchings in Mississippi alone. But get this. In Union County, think about that name, in Union County, there had never been a single lynching. That was practically unheard of for a Mississippi county at that time. Well, Sheriff Roberts, he took L.Q. Ivy, and he secretly took him out of the county. He took him to the jail one county over in Aberdeen. Meanwhile, back in New Albany, see, it was a Friday afternoon in the fall, and the word, it started to get around. Most of the farmers, they already had their crops laid by, so they had time on their hands. And as the word spread, they started to gather, come into town. They say that by Saturday afternoon, the crowd outside the hospital was 4,000 people. There weren't 1,000 souls living in that town. Inside the hospital, Bessie Gaines was said to be clinging to life. Outside the hospital, people were starting to get lively. And so Judge Pegram, the local judge, he goes out to try and calm the crowd. He says, he promised them swift justice. We'll be swifter. Well, in turn, Mayor Tate and New Albany's favorite son, United States Senator Hubert Stevens, took their try to calm the crowd. They got the same kind of reaction. Go on home yourself. We want your advice, we'll ask for it. Well, it was Sheriff Roberts' turn. He addressed the people. He said, "He ain't here. They took him out of the county last night. He ain't here. So y'all go on home. Nothing to do. Go on home." Crowd kind of grumbled and shouted. But with their quarry out of reach, they really didn't have much choice, and they started to break up. Except there were a few that were a little more persistent. There was Billy Preston and his buddies. Now, I changed that name for his family. So Billy Preston and his buddies, they went over that evening to Judge Pegram's home, and they persuaded him to issue a writ. They argued Bessie Gaines may not live. So that young man's got to be brought back here immediately, so she can either identify him or clear his name. They were just thinking of that poor young man. And so Judge Pegram, he issued a writ. He ordered Sheriff Roberts to produce L.Q. Ivy by Monday morning for identification. Well, Sheriff Roberts, he didn't wait till Monday morning. He brought L.Q. back to town Sunday morning, when pretty much everybody in town was in church. And Bessie Gaines took a look at L.Q. in front of witnesses, including the judge, said she was not sure, but he looked like the man who attacked her. Well, by the time they got him out of the hospital, Billy Preston and 3 of his buddies were waiting for him. Well, the sheriff had 3 men with him, too, so it was kind of a standoff. But there was more people coming because church was just starting to let out. And the sheriff looks at Billy and says in kind of a low tone, "Not now. Not with her father and the judge here. You get some more of your boys, get a dozen boys, you come over to the jail. If you was to overpower us there, nothing anybody could say that we didn't do our jobs." Well, Billy and his boys, they said, thinking they had a deal, they said, okay, fine. They let the sheriff load L.Q. into the car. and drive off. About the time he was loading him into the car, Bessie's father, Bob, was standing, and he was standing back behind Billy and his boys on the other side. And he starts to talk. So they all turn away, turn their back on the sheriff. And Bob Gaines, he says he was not sure of his daughter's identification. And as people were gathering, he said, "I ask that my friends and neighbors take no hasty action." About that time, as he heard the tone of those comments, Billy Preston looked back over his shoulder. And he saw the sheriff's car down at the end of the street. It turned the wrong way. It turned away from the jail. "Boys, we've been had!" And they lunged for their cars. And the chase was on. But the sheriff and LQ, they had a head start. And the sheriff intended to use it. They raced through that town. They were headed for the bridge over the Tallahatchie River. Only place to cross that river in 30 miles in either direction. As soon as the sheriff got to that bridge, he stopped the car, set 2 of his deputies out with orders to hold that bridge as long as they could. And then he, the other sheriff, and LQ Ivy, they lit out across that bridge, hell-bent for leather. Going for all they were worth, they were headed for Holly Springs. About an hour's drive away, largely African-American community just to the north of New Albany. Well, their pursuers got to the bridge just minutes behind them. Guns were drawn on both sides. But the 2 deputies were quickly overwhelmed by more than 100 people at this point. The bridge was cleared, and the chase was on again. They lit out in those cars. Well, the next chapter was pretty quickly written. See, telephones were pretty rare in those parts, but there was a telephone right next to that bridge. And a man who saw what happened, he called ahead to the next town on the road, Myrtle. And right after he made that call, there were 2 cars drove out of Myrtle. And at the first culvert, they set up a roadblock. So you got the sheriffs and Ivy going down that road, headed towards that roadblock. And behind them comes the mob from New Albany. Well, it didn't take long. They were cornered. They took LQ. And they brought him over to Goolsby's barn. Remember, that's where they were cutting timber, at Goolsby's place. They wrapped him in chains. And they suspended his chains by a rope in that barn. And they pursued some enhanced interrogation. They got a blowtorch. And they singed all the body hair off of LQ. And then somebody procured a pair of lemon squeezers. And they ground his testicles to a bloody pulp. Well, by and by, that 17-year-old boy was persuaded to confess to the crime. So they put his clothes back on, and they brought him out to the crowd outside the barn so he could confess in front of everybody, which he did. They also posed for photographs. I actually have the photograph. I got it right over there. It's in the Library of Congress. Somebody found an old steel buggy axle. This is about the time that Papa showed up on the scene, my grandfather. And they drove that axle into the ground like a giant stake. A couple of men chained LQ Ivy to that stake. They piled some wood at his feet. And they covered it in kerosene. 3 men stepped forward, Billy Preston, one of them. And they lit that fire. And LQ Ivy screamed. He screamed out! Now, the people in this room can only imagine what the sound of a man screaming who is literally on fire sounds like. But not my grandfather. He doesn't have to imagine it. He was there. He heard it. He heard LQ Ivy scream. And LQ Ivy screamed, "Have mercy. I didn't do it. Have mercy, I didn't do it. Well, half a century later, Papa lay in his hospital bed. We'd lose him not long after that. And it was that scene that haunted Papa for all those years. And as he lay in that hospital bed, I lay scrunched up against the wall just outside, hiding and listening. My heart pounded in my ears as I heard this story. And Papa said in that cold, dead, unusual voice for him, they burned him. I can still hear his screams every day. I can smell him burning. That's what haunted Papa. But what's really bothered me, and what's bothered me for 3.5 decades that followed, that's what he said next. He said there wasn't nothing anybody could do to stop it. That sense of helplessness in the face of such injustice, that bothered me. You know, and years later, as I researched the story, I came across an interview with L.Q. Ivy's sister-in-law. She had to be 90 years old when she gave that interview. And what amazed me is she talked about the lynching, and she said the same thing Papa said. Wasn't nothing anybody could do to stop it, that helplessness. I just couldn't take that. And when I was young, I vowed that I would prove Papa wrong when my chance came. After all, you know, Hollywood taught me. It just takes the courageous act of one man to save the day, right? So I pictured myself as Gregory Peck or John Wayne, ready for the rescue, just waiting for my moment to come. But you know, my Hollywood moment, it didn't come. And you know, as I got older, I kind of realized something too. I had no reason whatsoever to believe that I could have accomplished what Bessie's father, the mayor, the senator, the deputies, and the sheriff weren't able to accomplish that day. No reason to think that whatsoever. And that really depressed me. And then I started to get overwhelmed by that sense of helplessness as I looked around at my world and saw the injustices, large and small, and it just depressed me incredibly. And I started to think, well, Papa and Miss Ivy, they were probably right. You know, and then one day, I was putting my young son to bed. And before I put him to bed, I told him something he'd done that day that had made me proud. And I turned, and as I went over to switch off the light, I heard, "Daddy, what did you do today to make you proud of yourself?" And it came to me right then. You know, the question's not what you like to think you might do. If that Hollywood moment ever came so you could stop that mob, that's not the question. The question is, what is it that you do every day to build a community that's so strong that that mob bent on injustice never forms? So I want to leave you tonight with a challenge. And that challenge is, when you drive home, answer my son's question. Are you proud of what you did today?